and a great deal of application. So this will give me a platform 5 weeks running. So we've got this week, next week, and the first 3 Sundays, and the last one being April 17, Resurrection Sunday. So I wanted to run a series that will allow me to show you a lot of things, and most of these would not be new. I have plenty, so I could just use only new slides, but actually some of the best slides I have I've used before as well. So we're going to be, I'll show you a few. Today is more or less an introductory part to Jerusalem and the travel of Christ coming down to Jerusalem and exactly what's happening there. So I'll give you a bit of overview, but then we have a number of themes and topics and events that are all taking place. Now, obviously, one thing that I would like to review for you is the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and his timeline. So in a nutshell, I'll just preview this with you. You can look forward to a little more time on this. I just find it impossible to crowd in 3 days and 3 nights between Friday night and before sunrise Sunday morning. I've just tried the math. I've even used new math, whatever that is. And even new math doesn't come out that way. Wow, how about that? The one place where we agree with new math, huh? But what's the importance of 3 days and 3 nights, and why would I not really go wild over Friday crucifixion? And it's because it doesn't fit. So I want to take a little time in one of our Sunday school lessons that we'll be talking about that. This is a view of Israel with all of its parts in the time of Christ. So we've got Herodian titles for a great deal of this, but especially you're looking at Jesus on the shore of Galilee where Capernaum is. And you remember his earlier public ministry was primarily Galilean ministry. He traveled down to Jerusalem for the festival days, but you find him on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples, mentoring them. And then eventually, not only did he travel down periodically and leave the country in different directions, which is a study in itself. Why did he do that? But then we find him traveling down to Jerusalem. Now, I've shown you before there were 2 aspects of this that make that route so primary for anyone from the north traveling down to Jerusalem. For Jesus, it was, I must needs go through Samaria. That was hostile territory for Jewish people because of the animus between the Samaritan people and the Jews, and it worked both ways. I remember going through Samaria just on our bus. One of the years I went, we went through Samaria, saw Nazareth and Cana and so on. And we got rocked. The Samaritan people, interestingly, because very difficult for them to find marriage partners who are either Gentile or Jewish, because they're stuck in the middle. They're the product of the Jewish people who remained in the land, not the ones that were deported to other parts of the world. They remained in the land and they did exactly what God said don't do. They intermarried with the Gentiles that were imported. And so over that 70-year period, they began to find a husband or a wife from the Gentile peoples, and the Gentile peoples coming in would find Jewish people to marry. And so before long, and God said, do not do that. So now when the captivity is over, that group of people in the central district of Israel found themselves really at odds with all the Jewish people and with all the Gentile people too. They were considered to be, this is probably not a politically correct remark, but half-breeds. It's kind of that idea. That they're not the best of the Jews or of the Gentiles. They're a cross between the two, and neither side wants to own up to them. So traveling through there, you kind of take your life in your own hands because they don't like that. That reminds me, there was a woman of Samaria at a well in John chapter 4. And there is a Samaritan in the story in Luke 10, which we will be looking at tonight, the Good Samaritan. And that adds a backdrop to all that's going on, the hostility. and the undercurrent and the hatred, which makes the Good Samaritan story stand out even more. So who was it, again, that ministered to the man beaten up and left for dead? It was a Samaritan helping a Jew. Whoa. If that doesn't throw a monkey wrench in the whole story. And then Jesus uses that to talk to that lawyer, that expert in the law, who's asking, who's my neighbor? And by the time you get done with the story, the whole thing is actually flipped. So we'll look at that tonight, but that's Samaria. And then the other part is, by and large, it would be an easier route, and you could avoid the Samaritan district by crossing over early. You could cross the Jordan at any point up above and travel to the east side of the Jordan River, or you could go over to the coast to go down. That would be a lot longer. But Jesus went through Samaria, but then he crossed over, and then he came back across. Now today, down in the south, the way you cross from one side to the other is the Allenby Bridge, named after a British general. And there is a small, modest bridge because it's a small, modest river. It's not the Mississippi. It's like the little rivulet or stream in your backyard, maybe, if you happen to have one.
It's kind of like the Whippany River.
Yeah. And that's only when they get rain. They always have water running there, but most of the year there's not much there. But this gives you an idea of the districts at least. A picture both of the Jerusalem territory on the right and that route on the left in a little different graphic presentation makes it very clear to see. But going down through Samaria and then crossing the Jordan, going further south in Perea, and the term Perea means over across. And so that district or that area called Perea. And so Jesus traveled there and then he went back across. You remember that one of the key stories at the end of the Gospel of Luke is in Luke 19. That was Zacchaeus and the sycamore tree in the town of Jericho. So all of these things just begin to register at a certain point. But there you have at least a travelogue of the Lord. I also wanted to show you something that will serve us well tonight when you read the story that a man was traveling on his way down to Jericho. What do you mean down to Jericho? Look at the top left and notice Jerusalem at that elevation. And now, very few miles from there, it's a day's journey, down to Jericho is actually 720 feet below Mediterranean sea level. That's a rapid descent, and when you're traveling down, that would be like traveling across country, and there are certain places where they don't want trucks that have air brakes to be on this road because if something gives out when you come down that hill. And certain roads, you know, have a turn-off ramp. And as soon as they get off of that road, their brakes are failing and they're going at quite a clip. There is sand galore to help them just come to a stop. It'll go down and then they have filled it with sand and then a truck can stop without any brakes, but it would be a hair-raising experience. Then they have to, of course, get a tow truck in there to pull it back out of the sand and go get it repaired. But look at that drop. So the road just winds from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And then down below is the Dead Sea. So remember, the Sea of Galilee, way up to the north, and the Jordan River flows down to the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is already way below sea level. That's Mediterranean sea level. The different sizes of inhabited Jerusalem through the ages. So King David, and the city of David is that little peninsula shape there in the yellow. That was Jericho. Now the square block up above is the hilltop that David bought that would be the site of the temple, but God wouldn't allow David to build that. Solomon would build that. But he purchased the threshing floor on the top of that mountain. So that particular location, and then during King Solomon's time, King Solomon then began to build and develop the temple, and then Hezekiah in his time, and then Nehemiah after the exile coming back. Remember the destruction of Jerusalem, Hezekiah's day and beyond, 70 years of exile. And when Israel came back, not all of them came back, and it was a total rebuilding effort. So smaller population size inhabiting what had been a larger city. And then the Hasmonean period, and the dates are there, but then Herod the Great in the time of Christ, that's key. You could see how enlarged it is becoming under Herod's rule. And then the destruction, and that would be in 70 A.D. It began a little before. And finally the Byzantine, and that particular time period will lead us up to Muslim time, and from there beyond.
Can I ask a question before
Sure.
you go on?
Mm-hmm.
Black indicates the present walls of the city
Yeah.
of Old Jerusalem. So what you're saying is so much of, in the white area, was never the size of Jerusalem
Right.
as at that time, because we've been there, so that's
Yeah.
interesting to comment.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of, like, the whole area over there, so the city of David, which is south, right?
Yes.
That's not at all where it is today.
That's correct.
Even where the temple is.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the wall changed location and outer dimension several times through history.
And it only dates from, what, 1600 or so? Most
Yeah.
of it today.
Yeah.
Which is so amazing when you go and you think
Yes.
it's ancient. It's not.
Yes.
It's very funny.
So, and keep in mind, in the time of Herod the Great, one of the great debates is the location of both crucifixion of Christ and the burial of Christ. So there are two primary positions that are viewed, and one is the traditional, and that would be this really ornate gold tapestry-filled the tomb of Christ and the place where he died. And the key is finding out where the city walls were at the time. Why is that important? Because according to Jewish law, where will a man be put to death? Outside the city walls. So you'll drag that man outside and stone him or put him to death. And so Christ had to be crucified outside the city. Then according to the Bible, we have a tomb nearby. So wherever the place of crucifixion is, the tomb can't be too far away. So where the Catholic people and so many denominations just assume and they postulate this is it. And they think by their tradition, which was really established, first of all, by Helena, mother of Constantine. And she had dreams and visions, and she said, it was right here. Well, okay, thank you very much for your opinion. But where else might it be? Well, a British colonel discovered a very unusual looking outcrop of rock in a different location that we believe also was outside the city walls, but it was actually a little bit to the west and a little less to the north. And then he found, oh, and there's a garden here, and there is a tomb here with a stone, and so it's called Gordon's Calvary. By the way, just a little something, and it's only me, but I always get annoyed when everybody talks about the Calvary is coming. The Calvary is coming.
Yes.
Please, it's cavalry or it's Mount Calvary. It's one or the other, but don't interchange them. But just that LV and switching them around, and you just, I'm sorry, but it gets stuck in my head, and it's like, if this is a blackboard, you know. So anyway, so all of these are different depictions of that. In another way, we can look at this, and this would be the time of Christ. You do notice what is rarely even discussed much, so that's an aqueduct. And Herod was big on aqueducts, so from a higher area to collect all the drainage water and send it down in pipes or in a trough or a channel built up on columns, and that could flow all the way through town to a lower point. And don't forget with the principle in the law of water, water will seek its lowest level, but you know, as in siphoning, you can go downhill and you can go uphill and downhill, uphill, as long as the end point is below the top. So you actually can go up over some hills as long as you're not going back over the highest point where this originates. But Herod put in aqueducts in a lot of places. Caesarea Maritima, and it's still, there's an aqueduct there. A lot of it is broken down, some of it is still there, but other places too. In Masada, Herod developed that, and from the hills around in the Dead Sea area, he collected water and sent it into million-gallon cisterns on the top of Masada. He was such an engineer. But you begin to see, and there's Solomon's temple, and the whole topography is here. There are a lot of different models and scale models going back to David's time, and then the top of this would be the hill that becomes Calvary or Mount Moriah. Now, if we're going to connect these two, the site of the temple, where David said we're going to put the tabernacle, or the temple rather, here, and we're going to bring the furnishings in, the Ark of the Covenant, and all of these come in when Solomon builds this. But that threshing floor is also known as Mount Moriah. But Mount Moriah goes way back to another much earlier event, and it had to do with a man named Abraham, where Abraham did what? He offered his son Isaac. And the declaration, the description of Abraham and Isaac's relationship is Isaac, Abraham's only true son, whom he loved dearly. And now those words are imported in the New Testament when God, at the time of Christ's baptism, and in John 3:16, announces, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And the story of Abraham offering his only son Isaac, and then God interrupting him and not accepting that as a sacrifice, said, "Actually, I just wanted to see your faithfulness and your trust in me, and so I will provide a substitute." And there's redemption. There's a story of God providing the substitute for you and me. So we're not on the cross of Calvary, suffering physically and spiritually and in every dimension. No, God interrupted all that and said, "You couldn't possibly pay me enough to satisfy me, but I will accept payment from my own dear son." What a story. So the history of Mount Moriah is right here. This also shows up in Galatians chapter 4, where you have the allegory teaching us that we ought not want to go back under law. And then the contrast between Abram's two women. One was Sarah, who gave birth, Sarah the free woman, who gave birth to the son of liberty, the son of promise, that being Isaac. And the other woman who stepped in early when Sarah volunteered, "Well, why don't you go in? We can't have children, we're too old." And God promised, but it's just not going to work. And so born out of flesh, born according to fleshly answer to solving God's problem, that they're not going to have a child. Sarah must not be able to bear and conceive. So how about my substitute, my surrogate? How about you take Hagar? And so Abraham did, and they had a son named Ishmael. But now he becomes the son born in slavery of a slave woman, and he represents slavery, and that represents Mount Sinai. How about that? That's Galatians 4, which is the law and flesh and human effort. And God said, "Don't do it that way." But Abraham had already done it that way. Nevertheless, the promise remained with Sarah and her son Isaac. And he's the son of promise. And he represents liberty, freedom from the bondage of sin. So if you want discussion about the wearing effect and the oppression of law, the real question in Galatians 4 that begins in chapter 1 and goes all the way through the book, this is what the book is about. Why would anyone want to go back under the law? You who say, "I was made perfect in the eyes of God by the work of Jesus Christ alone, and it set me free." So Paul asks the question in Galatians, why do some of you say we ought to revert and go back under the bondage of the law? And so we were saved by grace or faith alone, but we need to complete our salvation by working hard, going back under works and law. That's what Galatians is all about. So when you think of this area, think of Mount Moriah. Think of the death of Christ. Think of freedom from all of that. A little larger population you can see as that grows in Hezekiah's time and beyond. This is a picture of a model. It's called the Holy Land Hotel model. It was built by a man who took most of his life. These are all marble blocks. And he chipped them to size. The wall of this is roughly knee-high. And so you can walk around it, but it would be probably the size, the whole layout of Jerusalem in the time of Christ, Herod's Jerusalem, would be probably half of our lower level here in church. It would probably be about the size of the auditorium upstairs. So that wall, knee-high, goes all the way around and followed the shape of the archaeological digs and findings, and then putting together everything, including the topography, the contours of the land. So we often go there. That was actually
Where's that?
well, it was up on the hill outside of Jerusalem. So you'd take a bus and get out and tour it. A man would walk around with a laser pointer and a stick. And everybody else would, don't walk in here, you'll knock the buildings over. They're all glued and secure, but they dismantled it and took it into a museum. So it's in Jerusalem itself now. Wonderful thing to visit. Another visual diagram, complete with a number of the things that happened. And so this is dealing specifically with the final week of Christ. But there were several events that happened there. And again, another view looking straight down. Just keep in mind that when you're looking here, you have to become oriented. But this is a much smaller temple, so that would be Solomon's temple right there. And again, another view, and this is David's. The peninsula, this is all going downhill, and it forms a little island or peninsula down here. And David began construction here, yes.
Do you know where on that sketch there the current western wall might be?
Yeah, it probably would be this wall here. That's the west side, and the eastern.
That's
No.
heavily by the topography, is it not? I mean, because doesn't it drop off?
Yeah, it does. And there's a Tyropaian valley that flows down through there. But the eastern gate would be up here, or the eastern gate would be over on this side. And the temple complex, with Herod's coming, actually brought in fill, dirt, and rocks and extended the flat part of the temple area way out this way. He enlarged this by so much. It was a much more grand temple, but in a sense it wasn't a pride thing with Israel because Herod did it. And so this was not original. It wasn't even the temple later. This shows some of the different sizes along the way and when that took place and the dating of that. All the way down to the Temple Mount under Muslim, that yellow layer and the dome is the Dome of the Rock. It's the Mosque of Omar. The Mosque of Al-Aqsa is the silver one here. So this is the southern side. That's the north. That's the west. That's the western wall. And then the eastern gate is out this way. Another view of this in a painting form would be when Solomon dedicated the temple and all that went on. So this will give you a little view of the lavers. There's the giant laver over there. Behind us here were giant candelabras as well. But all of this was enlarged and glorified by Herod's construction. This is inside the holy place. Back behind the altar of incense, through that curtain, you see the seam there. Inside there was the Ark of the Covenant, and that compartment, half of this size, is called the Holy of Holies. This is the holy place. Inside there is the Holy of Holies. And the priests are ministering the table of showbread here, and the golden, we call it candlestick. It's not really, they didn't have beeswax candles then. It was oil. So there were oil lamps up there, and they would fill it with oil. They would trim the wick on a daily basis to keep the carbon from building up and so on. But this gives you at least a little picture of what that must have looked like. And don't forget, the high priest went through that curtain one time per year, once a year, and he would offer sprinkled blood on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, which is called the mercy seat. And it was an anticipation every year to remember someone has to atone for our sins. But why would they do it every year? Because nobody qualified can pay for our sins until, Hebrews says, once for all, our great high priest entered there and offered his own blood. So what a reminder, there's no more need for annually to show up, have the high priest go in and represent all of us. They would also have bells around the hem of his robe and a rope tied to an ankle, because if he walked in there representing us as the high priest, and he shouldn't be in there with his own sin, never confessed, never acknowledged, never a sacrifice on his part, holding the wrath of God in abeyance until finally Christ would come. But he now presumptuously goes in there as though he's the chief and he's going in for us. And he had no business being in there for us, let alone for himself. And all of a sudden the bells stop tinkling. And they've got a hold of the rope and they're listening and they're listening and they're listening. And eventually they realize what happened and they drag it back out. Lying there on the floor, God took his life. He had no business being in there. But the bells and the rope. This is a picture of the destruction of Jerusalem, 70 A.D., and you can hardly imagine what this meant to the Jewish people. You know, they'd come back from the exile, and they had been in the land for just a few centuries, about 3.5 centuries or so, and now because of their kicking up their heels and objecting to Rome and rebelling and showing their temper on a few occasions, Herod said, okay, send Titus in and we'll just clean house and wipe it off the map, and so the destruction of Jerusalem. And then since that time it's been quite a struggle. The Jewish people have been essentially more out of the land than in the land, but always under another power. And it wasn't just Rome. Prior to that it was Greece, and prior to that the Persians, prior to that the Babylonians, but they could never get their feet back on the ground and be their own people until the mid-1900s. And they won a serious victory and declared independence. But they still are not the people of God that God wants them to be. This is the Muslim because we ended Jewish changes at that time period. So you notice at the top far left corner is the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of Omar, and then down here is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And some of the pictures then would be modern Jerusalem with the gates that go back to Muslim times, and the eastern gate being down in that direction as well, and the city of Jerusalem. And now you start to visualize, wow, this place is humongous with hundreds of thousands of residents, and that is the case. The scale model again, which we were looking at before, and once again, the corner far left in a model form, Herod's temple. And on top of that, called a pinnacle, from the pinnacle of the temple, one of the temptations of Christ. Satan said, cast yourself off. And what a twisted invitation to have Christ give up his authority to Satan. Satan, why would he even say, why would he remark and claim, if you bow down to me, I will return to you the kingdoms? It actually is because he is called the prince of the power of the air, the God of this age and this world. He is given, with God's permission, much control over the world right now. So did he have any business saying, I will give it back to you? And I say, yeah, actually he did. He would never do that, nor would Christ say, I will bow down to you so I can have control of the world again. No, when it's time to control the world, trust me, he'll just take it back. And he doesn't have to ask permission from anybody. It's God the Father that hands him the right and the authority, the title deed to the whole world. And he will have that in the book of Revelation, chapter 5. Another view of that, and another. Now, what's behind us here? What's on this hillside? This goes steeply down to the Kidron Valley. What is this? Mount of Olives. Garden of Gethsemane. That's up here. And over on that side, over in that far section, top left corner, That is part of the newer city, but the house of Caiaphas is in there, and that's where Jesus was taken to be interrogated and also beaten. That's also in the vicinity, a little further, is the room that most of us think is the upper room. It's a building, and it could easily hold that. I'll show you pictures of that in one of our lessons here in the next 5 weeks.
But hadn't that been destroyed and then was rebuilt?
Much was destroyed, not everything, but yes, that's true of a great portion. But there were some things that were there or rebuilt on the same site.
Right.
But the foundation of the walls was essentially the same, but rebuilt. Oh, I wanted to just make a comment. One of my earlier trips to Israel, I remember being out late at night, taking a walk around the city. And I walked along, and this is a Muslim cemetery, both there and here. And so you honor the dead. You try not to violate what they would want. But I took a walk along that wall, and there's a full moon out. It was really quite an evening. And I came along and noticed where the eastern gate is, right there. And the ground was sunken a bit, as would happen with heavy rains and with the cemetery, so tombs down below. A man named Jim Fleming had been in here. He was very much involved with Biblical Archaeology Review, a magazine that for years tends to be more liberal than we would be, but it actually is a cutting edge, talk about archaeological digs and finds. But Jim Fleming had walked along there one time. That was before I was there. And in the night with the soft ground, he actually fell through. He had his camera with him. He was able to take a picture because he fell down a number of feet and was actually in a cavern, a cemetery, a sepulcher. But he noticed that the frame of a door was on the wall up above it. So this is all later wall. This is not New Testament times. The New Testament wall was down underneath that wall. So he was down underneath the eastern gate, and there's a gate down there, and he took a picture of it. He came back the next day, and the Muslims had closed that up. They'd shoveled it back full, and they had made it so nobody could get near it. But he declared, I believe I found the original Golden Gate, the eastern gate. And you know from Bible truth that the Lord will go through that eastern gate when he comes back. It is very possibly, very likely, the gate through which he rode on a donkey on Palm Sunday. So, but what you're looking at is a whole layer above that. So there again is an aerial shot. You are looking again toward the Mount of Olives directly across, and this is the newer city. This is the extension that goes down to the south side. This is quite a steep drop off, and this is the Hinnom Valley here. And the southern wall here, and the gate there is called the Gate of Ge, which is the word G-E, Gamma, Eta. That's the word for earth or land, a place of Hinnom. Gehenna is the word that comes from it. And do you know what that is? Gehenna is our understanding of hell. And it was because of the ever-burning fires down there. In pagan worship before the Israelites, they would actually offer human sacrifices there, and including the burning of babies. They had a god Moloch, and they would light a fire, light all the wood, and the arms of that idol, metallic, would heat up, and then they would lay the infant on those arms and sacrifice that child. And the screams of the child were covered up with the beating of the drums, and that word is tophet in Hebrew. And so there was an association of trying to drown out the cries of the child with the beating of the drums, because otherwise you would hear just grotesque. It would just curl your fingernails. It would just, to hear a baby scream until it was dead. But they would offer the sacrifice of babies. But it also became very possibly the word picture for the ever-burning fires of the lake of fire, which is hell. But that Gehenna is the word that we translate as hell.
When we were in Israel, I found it very interesting that they didn't talk about that at all.
Yeah.
They didn't talk about that. And
Yeah.
we worked through that area, but
Yeah.
they didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
But that's curious.
You might just point out the western wall in that picture.
Yeah, the western wall will be up on that side over there. I'll be showing you more pictures of that later. I'm going to avoid lingering too long there. I did do that 2 to 3 years ago, and we spent quite a while. There are a number of arches. I'll show you at least a couple pictures because it is really interesting, and reconstructions. This again is a drawing. There's the Golden Gate most of the way up there, and there's the Dome of the Rock. And in that Dome of the Rock, I will give you my impressions, because when we were there with Muslim permission, we had to have clearance and so on. We obviously couldn't be Jewish, but we were allowed to go in there and see the rock. And presumably that's the rock where Abraham offered his son Isaac. And it was very likely. Do you see where it says Holy of Holies, and just above that is a little rectangle, and above that is the word Ark? Because there are 2 or 3 views as to the exact location of where was the temple and where was the Holy of Holies in the temple, which then would locate the situation of the Ark. And so that's it right there. Now, not everyone agrees. Some think there's a little cupola a little further north, and some think that actually under that cupola is where the Ark of the Covenant was. So they've rearranged the location. And this is a view. There's the rock, there's where the Ark, and there was a cut out area for the Ark of the Covenant to rest right there. There also is in that rock a channel that was cut out so that when sacrifices were made on that rock, the blood would flow down into the channel and then underground all the way downhill out the southern side. So the blood would flow. The inauguration of the temple when Solomon first built this, and in Kings, 1 Kings, it records the fanfare and the celebration. But if you stop and think about the quantity and the volume of oxen that were killed and slaughtered and burned on the altar in honor to God for giving them the temple, and the Bible describes that blood flowed and flowed and flowed from slaughtering the animal, draining the blood, offering that to God. And then also, I don't know if you can imagine, if you've been around a butcher shop or if you've been around where meat is processed, after a while you kind of have to get used to and adapt to the smell of dead animals, particularly the blood. And there is quite a stench to it, as a continual reminder of the awfulness of sin and the awfulness and the stench in the nostrils of God of that sin and what it represents, and for the blood of Christ to be offered for us. Such an awful, horrific thing, but necessary for you and me to have everlasting life. But this picture here, we're sanitized so much. We don't even know what it's like. Many of us don't know what it's like to take care of our own meat. Now, of course, in hunting, we do that. But most people just are appalled. Oh, no, I don't know. Less information, please, I don't want to know. You're just happy to go into the meat counter and pick it up in this styrofoam tray covered with a piece of saran. And it looks so fresh, you know. But, boy, if you were to look in the butcher shops, go to other countries. Some of you have been there. See it hanging off of a hook up here, and shoo the flies away and pick out whichever one of the pieces of meat you want, whether it be chicken or beef or pork, or you just pick it out, but get the flies off and then take it home, and that's your supper. But we're really a sanitized people. We're not used to that. You have no idea what that was like on the day of inauguration. The smell, the sights, the stench, and what it means to see all that blood, all those meat pieces and body parts. But that was...
You're not allowed when you go in there. You can't go in there, right?
Oh, yeah, I was starting to tell you my impression. Yes, you can go inside here. My impression, okay. So it's holy ground. So please take your shoes off, your sandals or shoes. So you want it just really simply put. You want me to just tell you my experience? We've been in there 2 or 3 times at least on different trips. The smell of 1,000,000 sweaty feet. Okay, I thought about it. What's the nicest way I could put it? That would be the nicest way I could put it. And you would really like, when you get out of there, go back to your hotel, you'd really like to take a shower. You definitely want to wash your feet. but people have to take their shoes off. And that was Bible too. That was tradition among all the early cultures. And God said to Moses at the burning bush, take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. But you go in there where several million people have been in there before. They all took their shoes off and they all walked there, and they didn't all have clean feet. And and yeah, it's like that. If you can get by that, then you can ponder that rock and what was here in Israeli times. So this is the Dome of the Rock, it's called, with a golden plated dome. And there you can see the Temple Mount around it. This is the western wall, lit up at night. Well, what experience this is right here. And there's a divider there that goes to the wall, and on this side the women, on that side the men. And there is also a gate. You can't see it well, it's too dark over there, but there's a gate, an arch that goes up against that part of the wall, and underneath there is where men go, and their container, which opens up, and there are Bible scrolls. There are also prayer books, and all in Hebrew, of course. But people will go up to that wall. They'll go inside there and they'll read. I have mentioned before, we've never spent a long time on some of the customs and traditions. But standing out there, you notice that men rock back and forth. They'll be holding this prayer book, and they'll have the locks. They'll have their hat. But of course, in approaching God, we have to have a hat as well. They'll give us a little paper covering, or we can't be in that area. But they'll rock back and forth. And that's based upon Old Testament scripture that implies that they're moving in their prayer. So they have, again, in a Pharisaical way, they've elevated that, amplified that to, okay, you'll move. You can move right to left, left to right, or you can move forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. But you have to be moving all the time because that's the custom. And they take that from the Bible and derive from that, oh, that's the law. You have to do it that traditional way. So there are a lot of customs, but in that wall, they will write notes to God. These are prayers. And I suppose the number one would be taken from Psalms, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So people pray for world peace and for Israel to be safe and for God to protect Israel. Fold it up and stuff it in the cracks. You take a pencil or something and just keep stuffing it. I would think that wall has become more solid over the centuries just with the paper supply that has become brick-like in its strength with all that paper stuffed in there. I have also been there and in the temple area. I remember one occasion, it was dead of night, very late, and I think someone else was with me. I think he came along, I'm not sure. But I actually enjoyed talking to the soldiers. I went to the soldiers who were, machine guns. I mean, they were armed and ready because there were all kinds of skirmishes and small explosives. They now have metal detectors, and people have to have their backpacks searched just to get near the temple wall. But I talked to them. I remember that well. I was in my early 20s, I think, when I went on that trip. And I can't tell you how thoroughly I enjoyed just visiting with these men. Many of them spoke English. But asking them about their experience in Israel and the fear factor of, and they live with that. They expect bombs to go off, but they're just committed, and they're not going to let terrible, terrible things happen. So they're there to protect. Eastern Gate. 4 quarters, Muslim quarter, Christian quarter, Armenian quarter, and Jewish quarter. And they all coexist there, but it's always tense. There's no peace there now because the world is in turmoil and the Jewish people are under threat of attack, assassins, bombers, everything. All the time they live that way. Now this is going to be another one of our pursuits here, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and the timing element. I selected this one just to give you a little idea. I'm sorry this is a little fuzzy. For some reason it didn't retain its pixel clarity, but 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. We'll want to look at those verses and look in more detail. The prepositional arrangement of the phrases after 3 days and 3 nights, or in 3 days and 3 nights, or through 3 days and 3 nights. Slightly different purpose and perspective with each one. But the element that's very common is 3 days and 3 nights. Now, if that's going to happen, and knowing if this is marked in Jewish calendar days, then you know it begins at, we'll say, sundown, and runs till sundown the next day. That's a day. And the protocol for this is actually set up in Genesis, where God created. And then at the end of each day's creative fashioning by God, there's the declarative remark. And the evening and the morning were day number 1. Yom Echad, day number 1. And then the next day's creation. And day 2 was the evening and the morning, the second day, day number 2. Whenever in the Hebrew language you have a specific number and enumeration, it's not a 1,000-year period or just a span of time, like a creative sequence of a few million years. Cannot be. And then when the Bible adds the evening and the morning, the nighttime and the daytime constitute day number 1. So what I'm saying is the arrangement on the cross of Calvary, where Jesus was removed from the cross, and you and I both know that it was important for them to take him off the cross because the Passover is coming, or the Sabbath is coming. But he had to be off the cross before the trumpet blew to announce that we're now in that day. And that'll be around twilight. And all the people kind of knew, but even when they don't have clocks, they see the sun and they know at a particular time, it's all calculated by the Jewish leadership. And when that trumpet announces, okay, the day has begun. This is a celebration day, it's a feast day, no work is to be done, and so on. Okay? So we know it had to be before that. But the question becomes, is this the Saturday Sabbath? So when we talk about this another time, I want to show you from Scripture that actually there's more than one Sabbath, and different festival days were called high holy Sabbaths. Those are the feasts in Leviticus 23. So you've got Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, certainly the Pentecost, but you've got a trumpet, a Day of Atonement later on. So all those are marked by the rabbinical priestly leadership. They blow the trumpet. But there's no way that you can have the 3 days and 3 nights end before sunrise, you know, very early in the morning. Another gospel says, while it was still dark, the women came to the tomb and it was empty. So Jesus had vacated. But by the time you get to that point, you have to have completed 3 days and 3 nights. Are you with me on that? Or is it not that important and God's just sort of approximating and just saying, well, everything's taken care of, we'll call it 3 days, 3 nights, because that's sort of a completion of the things that had to be done. But we don't mean 3 days and 3 nights. We don't mean 72 hours. But if you mean 72 hours, he had to be on the cross on Wednesday, give his life, and come off the cross before the next day began at twilight. So 3 days and 3 nights. So yes, I believe in a Wednesday crucifixion. So now part of our job will be talking about the sequence of events found in the Gospels that are telling us of Palm Sunday, and he went into the temple, and he talked to the people there, and he taught this, and he collided with the leaders here, and then they left, and they went over to Bethany, and they spent the night in the fig tree on the way, and in the morning, and so on. And then they came back and had what seemed like a full day. And I'm saying, so that they're there Monday, and they went back another day, and it was Tuesday. But all of these others are saying Wednesday and Thursday. But they admit that there are some gaps, and we don't know what all they did, but they're assuming there's a Wednesday, Thursday, because they want to get us to Friday, since we all know that's when Jesus was crucified. No, we don't all know that. That's an assumption that people make to get to the Good Friday. But they've named it Good Friday based on some hollow ground. But when you begin to add it up, so the real kicker in this, I think, is that Tuesday was a day like no other days, as our Lord braces himself, steels himself tomorrow's the day. And when they had the Lord's Supper together, Tuesday night, and they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and on the way out they sang a hymn, went to the garden. Judas shows up with the Roman soldiers. Jesus is arrested, and now it's late at night, maybe midnight at this point, and they tie him and they lead him captive back over to meet with the high priest to be interrogated and whipped and flogged. And through the night, trials, and by morning in front of Pilate, and then he's hauled off. The crowd called, "Crucify him," and they did. And that was Wednesday morning. So all these things really happened on Tuesday that loaded that day up. And at the end of the day, they went back to the upper room, and they enjoyed the last meal together. Because later that night, Garden of Gethsemane, arrest after being betrayed, hauled off to the high priest, and then through the night, interrogated and beaten, and in the morning, pronounced he will be executed. He'll be put on a cross and crucified. That was Wednesday. So I need to go over that with you at some point. I'm going to stop right here. We have about a minute left. I haven't given you the full program of the different things that I hope that we'll have time to talk about over the next 4 Sundays. But it'll be more like this. I mean, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. So,
Got it.
Got it.
okay, I'll give you a quiz on that.
So obvious question.
Yeah.
So why for all of our lives have we celebrated Good Friday on Friday?
Actually,
Or
one simple reason.
Why is the time all off? It's very obvious.
Yeah, one simple reason.
I thought about it for many times, and I guess I just never questioned it. That's not 3 days and 3 nights.
They're going based upon the fact that the Bible says that it was going to be the Sabbath. And without realizing, without acknowledging Sabbath applies to all these other feast days, they assume it's Saturday Sabbath, so this must be Friday. And so Friday night, twilight, the Sabbath begins. And they had to take him off the cross because the next day is Sabbath, and we're about to begin that at twilight, Friday night. So get him off the cross and bury him quick, because we cannot do any work. And handling the dead is strictly forbidden. It's not only work, it is absolutely taboo. You cannot do that. And so you'll be unclean for the Sabbath. You cannot do that. So get him off the cross and get him in a tomb quickly. But they failed to understand that the Sabbath being referred to there was not actually the Saturday Sabbath, but a high Sabbath. It's called Passover. And that year, on the 14th of Nisan, that didn't fall on Saturday. Thursday. Okay. Thank you. We'll pick up here. We have a lot even before we get quite to that point. Many other things, but thank you. You're